All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Well, as Betsy had already mentioned, if you are just getting on and you're seeing the auto caption at the bottom of your screen and you don't want to see that, go ahead and go to your Zoom window, and then at the bottom there should be a little CC symbol. If you click that, you can turn it off so you don't see that. We are recording today's session, and obviously that's going to get put in the box folder that you all will should have the link for by now, but if not, we will get that sent to you. And we are we are enabling people's talking ability, so just be mindful of that as Mary Kate's presenting, and we will definitely have some open discussion at the end. So once we get to that point, feel free to unmute and talk. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker today, who is Mary Kate McKenzie, who is a farm business management specialist, both for the South Central New York Dairy and Field Crops Program and for Pro Dairy. So she has some split responsibilities, and she's going to talk to us today about maximizing your pasture investment. So thanks, Mary Kate, for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you, Alicia, and thanks everybody for being here. This is a topic that I'm really excited about, and I really appreciate the opportunity to get to share some thoughts with you today. And I'm hoping, I know that when we get into economics and talking about numbers, my presentations can sometimes get a little bit intense. So we've got a bunch of poll questions that we'll ask you guys to participate in throughout the presentation. And then, yeah, I may stop at different points along the way just to see if anybody wants to comment or ask questions. So hopefully we can get a little bit of discussion going. So, and I'll try to keep an eye on the chat box as well. So if you have a question and I'm in the middle of a sentence, feel free to just type it right into the chat. So we'll get started here. So this is our agenda. This is the plan for the next hour and a half. In order to think about making good investments in our grazing systems, my argument is that first we need to actually know what our pasture system costs, and we also need to know what the benefits are of the grazing system. So we're going to start out by talking about how we can determine the costs and benefits of the grazing system on our farm. Then we'll touch briefly on different types of improvements that we can make. We'll break those out into 3 different categories and help you guys think about what are kind of the low-hanging fruit areas, and then how do we analyze bigger investments in the grazing system to decide whether or not they're a good idea. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end about how we can actually monitor the changes that we make in case we need to adjust them. So before I dive in, I like to start with the big picture, like why do we care about this? And why do I care about this personally? So this is a picture of some of the land that my husband manages. We have a farm in Yates County. The business name is Sweetgrass Meats, and we're grazing about 280 acres. All of it is rented land. I call it repro to retail because we have a cow-calf herd and a breeding herd of sheep. So we're breeding, the mamas, and then we raise all of the calves and some of the lambs until they're ready to finish. And we're marketing meat direct to consumer by the cut. So we've got kind of the whole production process going on the farm. And one of the things that makes our farm special and our product special is that we're 100% grass fed. So we have a heavy emphasis on grazing to try and maximize the value of our production. And so we are constantly asking these questions about where should we make investments? How should we be managing the pasture system? What's the ideal stocking rate? Things, all these sorts of things. So this is kind of a daily experience and a central part of our lives as operators of a grazing farm. And I imagine that many of you are similarly occupied with these sorts of questions. So before we talk about how to calculate your pasture costs, we're going to do a quick poll to find out if you guys already know what your cost of production is. And so here you're welcome to give an educated guess, or you can be honest if you have completely no idea. So the question is, how much does it cost to operate your grazing system? And we have the options of less than $1 per head per day. So if you're, a cow, dairy, or beef producer, it'd be $1 per cow per day. Between $1 to $2 per head per day, or more than $2 per head per day. So I would love to see everybody vote. And if you don't have a farm, if you're like an educator here on this call, think of a farm that you work with and try to answer, with that farm in mind. So I guess I can end the polling and share results. And okay, great. So we had about half the group say that their cost is less than $1 per head per day. And that is where we are on our farm in Yates County with beef production. We're probably around 80 cents a head per day. We had one answer between $1 to $2. And I'm going to show you an example just on the next slide, looking at some dairy farms that were in that range for their cost of production. And then a couple of people have no idea. Appreciate your honesty there. So, so let's break down the cost of our grazing system into 3 broad categories. The first category are, we call the annual operating costs. So these are all the things that we normally think about spending money on in the course of a grazing season. We're going to repair the infrastructure that we have. We might do a little bit of reseeding in areas that were damaged, or some frost seeding to try to get some clover into the fields. And we might be seeding annual crops, which is like a 1 year, takes place in one operating cycle. Things like fertilizer, clipping, and weed control involve both the costs of those inputs as well as the labor and machinery costs associated with actually implementing that management practice. We may pay rent, and there may be additional labor associated with moving animals around. And then we also think about some overhead costs like taxes and insurance. You probably have one tax bill or one insurance bill for the farm, but a portion of those expenses is going to be influenced by the land that you have and are managing as your grazing system. So our operating costs are those costs that things that get implemented or used up or occur during that 1 year operating cycle. The second type of cost that we have for our grazing system are the long-term investments that we make. And we'd like to try to calculate these on an annual basis to understand, again, how much does our grazing system cost per year? And then we can look at that on a per head or per ton dry matter basis. So these longer term investments are things like fencing, infrastructure, water, laneways, and then some types of perennial plantings. If we're putting in a planting that we plan to graze for 3 to 5 years, that would count as a long-term investment. Same thing with lime. If you put lime down on your field every year, that's probably an operating cost. But if you're doing a larger application of lime once every 3 to 5 years, you might consider that a long-term investment. So operating costs are easy to measure because it's just how much we spend in that year. But for some of these longer term costs, we want to come up with an annual amount, and we do that in 2 ways. We calculate a depreciation cost of the investment by dividing the total cost by the useful life of that improvement. So if our fencing is we expect it to be around for 15 years, we would take the total cost of our fencing investment, divide it by 15, and that's a simple way to get an annual depreciation expense. We also need to think about the fact that if we invest a bunch of money in fencing, we can't use that money to invest in something else on the farm or off the farm. And so that is the concept behind the opportunity cost of our investment. So this is not a cash expense, but it's an economic cost that we also need to consider when we're thinking about the true cost of this system. So for the examples, I typically use a 7% rate of return or 7% opportunity cost. And that means we look at the 7% of the value of your investment over time. We'll show some examples of this in a moment. So category 1, operating expenses. Category 2, the annual cost of our long-term investments. And then number 3 is our annual cost of land ownership. So land typically does not depreciate. It does not lose its value over time. So we don't need to calculate a depreciation expense associated with land ownership. But we do know that there's a big opportunity cost of owning land, of having that large amount of capital tied up in that property. So again, we'd like to think that we would get a 7% return on that investment over time. And typically what we do is we know generally land actually goes up, the market value goes up over time. So we say that might make up half of our expected return, and then the other half we would want to get a return from management. So we use 3.5% rate of return to calculate our opportunity cost for land ownership. And just a simple example to help you wrap your heads around this, if we own 50 acres and the market value of that land is $2,500 per acre, we would multiply 50 times 2,500 times that 3.5% to get an annual opportunity cost of land ownership equal to $4,375. So on a per acre basis, that would be $87.50. And you can think about in your area, for your example, your farm, is that number more or less than you would pay to rent the same land? Right. And I think it's interesting to look at that because typically a lot of farms don't think about the cost of land ownership as being a cost of their grazing system because it's not something we're paying cash for every year. But in reality, it may be more expensive in a true economic sense than actually renting land where we have a cash payment every year, but oftentimes it's going to be less, particularly for grazing land. So those are our 3 categories. And so our next poll question is thinking again about your farm. Which of these 3 expense categories do you think makes up the largest portion of your total annual cost? So we've got operating costs, annual cost of long-term investments, and annual cost of land ownership. So if you don't own any land and you rent all your land, you can rule that last one out pretty quickly. I'll wait for a couple more votes, I think. Okay, very interesting. So here's our results. So nobody voted for annual operating costs, which is great. It means you guys must have very good cost control for your annual expenses on the grazing system. And the majority of folks voted for this annual cost of long-term investments. And I think this is very interesting because a lot of folks who maybe are getting into grazing or thinking about getting into grazing see these initial investments as a major barrier, right? The cost of installing high tensile fencing around 50 acres as a perimeter fence for many people seems prohibitively expensive. Same thing with whoops, did I share results? There we go. Same thing with some of the water infrastructure, especially if we're talking about like winterized watering systems, that can be a significant investment. So we're going to see on the next slide an example from some actual farms where this category is actually less of a contributor to the total cost than they expect. And then we had one person vote for the cost of land ownership. So here is an example, hypothetical example of what these kinds of costs might look like for a hypothetical farm. But I will say that this example is taken from sort of the average values from a group of 11 grazing dairies who completed the pasture cost calculator tool for the 2019 grazing season. I'm sorry, for the 2020 grazing season. So, anyway, this again reflects a sample of 11 farms. The size on average, we're going to say this hypothetical farm based on these averages had 122 cows, was dairy cows, was grazing 116 acres, had 0.95 acres per cow. They achieved 168 grazing days in 2020, which for some was a challenging year with dry weather. And they harvested 90% of the forage in their grazing system by grazing. So the other 5% was taken off by hay or as hay. So in this group, the annual operating costs were just over $100 an acre, and that made up 50% of their total. So in this group, this was the single largest contributing category to the overall expense of their system. The annualized cost of long-term investments came out to $24.50 an acre. And part of the reason this was low is that many of the farms in this group had older infrastructure that they were able to continue using. So they had fencing systems that were like 20 years old that we said, okay, that's been fully depreciated, but the farm was still getting value out of it. So folks who've been grazing longer, if they're able to maintain those infrastructure investments, that can really help to lower that cost category. And then finally, in this group, or in this hypothetical farm, our cost of land ownership was $76.59 an acre, which was 38% of the total. So our total annual expense for the grazing system was $203 an acre. And that comes out to $1.09 per cow per day. So again, this is just an example, and we'll look at some of the benefits and how can we tell if this number is good, right? Are we satisfied with this number? But again, this is just an example of how we can structure the costs of our system to analyze them. So if you would like to do this for your farm, which I highly recommend, this is the tool. We call this spreadsheet, this is an Excel spreadsheet that's called the Pasture Cost Calculator, and it utilizes financial records and production records from your farm to calculate the costs associated with your grazing system. So it will generate a cost per animal per day, and it'll also give you a cost per ton of dry matter produced. So in order to use this tool, you do need to have some basic financial and production records, but because it's set up as an annual, kind of gives you a cost on an annual basis, it's pretty easy to line up some numbers from your financial records or your tax return to fill out most of it. And Alicia is gonna include this in the box folder for this lecture series, so you guys all have access to this tool, and you can reach out to me or to your local extension educator for help using it. I guess I'll pause there. Any questions on the cost, figuring out your cost side before we talk about figuring out your benefits? No, okay. So now we're switching gears. So we're going to talk about how can we put a number on the value or the benefit that our grazing system provides to the farm. Typically, when we're thinking about the yield of a grazing system, we're thinking about the forage that we produce. And generally, we're focusing mostly on the quantity, right? So this would be the tons of total forage as fed to the cows, or more specifically, tons of dry matter we're putting in harvesting by grazing. However, it's important to look at some of the broader benefits of grazing as well when we're thinking about the value of this system. And we know that there's a quality aspect to our yield as well as a quantity aspect. And we also expect to see some other herd health benefits from grazing, as well as often improvements to labor efficiency compared to housing and feeding animals indoors. So how do we start to calculate and put numbers on some of these benefits? All right, so again, another poll question. Get your mice ready. In this case, I would like to know how you personally calculate pasture yields on your farm. And there's a bunch of options. You can pick more than one option here if you use multiple methods. So the first one is I use hay yields from similar fields to estimate my pasture yields. I measure vegetation throughout the season. I work with a professional grazing specialist. I calculate pasture consumed by grazing animals based on the projected dry matter intakes. I use another method, or I do not calculate my pasture yields. Awesome. There's I think one or two more people we're waiting on, so give you a few more seconds to answer the question. Okay. So here's the results. So we had a few folks say that they use hay yields from similar fields, and that is a method that is supported by NRCS. And you can, and we'll kind of show you some numbers on that in a minute. A couple people actually measure the vegetation on their farm, and I'd be curious to know as we continue going through this presentation what methods you use, how you actually do that. Nobody in this group works with a professional grazing specialist, and I think, in a lot of areas, access to those people with that expertise can be pretty limited. We had the majority of folks said that they calculate their pasture consumed based on their understanding of what their cows should be eating, which works great if you can't figure out how to use these other methods. And we had one person who does not calculate their yields. So I'm going to just kind of run down some different thoughts I have about how you might approach this on your farm and encourage you to approach this in some way. The idea here is that we might not be able to get a perfect number on our yields, but it is really important to have some way to quantify and track over time the yields from our system, because if we can't do that, how are we going to know whether the changes that we make are having an improvement? So one of the most basic ways to try and get a handle on your pasture production is to go get a soil map, which you can do from NRCS, and look at your soil type, and then go look up information about the projected yields for hay or for pasture on that soil type. So this is a picture of that field on our farm that you saw in the earlier picture. This is kind of a map of that one field. And this just shows some maps that I pulled up quickly from NRCS's Web Soil Survey app. So anybody can access this app and get this far along in the process. Or if you can't, you can get your extension, your local extension person to help. But the problem that I ran into is that the soil type that we have on our farm, there's no hay yield given, at least in the Web Soil Survey for this soil type. And it gives the projected pasture yield in sort of a animal units rather than tons of dry matter. So if you're gonna try to go this route, you're probably gonna need to reach out to someone at NRCS or an extension who maybe has a little bit more information about how to interpret the soil types that you have. The next option is taking a look at typical hay yield for your system, for your soils, and converting that into an expected pasture yield. So this table comes from the NRCS Prescribed Grazing Management Workbook. And I extrapolated a little bit because they have some higher numbers, and we see some farms, at least in our area, with some kind of lower hay yield numbers. And so the numbers in the top row show the annual hay yield in tons per acre. So for example, if you've got a soil type where you typically see 2.5 tons to the acre as a hay yield, you would go down to the number in the row below it. And that is a suggestion of what you might see as a pasture yield on the same soil type. And it's given in pounds of dry matter per acre per rotation. And the way this works is if you take that number, that 1,000 pounds to the acre, and you multiply it by 5, so that assumes you would get 5 rotations, you're going to get the number in the row above. So this is a very rough estimate. It can be useful for grazing planning and figuring out how many acres you need and how many paddocks you need and how to size your paddocks for the number of animals that you have. But in terms of putting an economic value on the forage that you're producing, these numbers are probably not accurate enough. And we know that we're not gonna actually get the same amount of forage in each rotation because, well, depending on how we manage, but we have different growth rates throughout the season. And, you know, we may not always get 5 rotations on some of our fields. But again, this is a good starting point. So then the next option is actually going out and measuring your forages throughout the season to get a handle on what's actually growing in your fields. And there's a number of different ways to do this. Some of them are fairly low tech, fairly accessible, although I would say that they're also mostly fairly time consuming. So I don't know a lot of farms that, that are out there measuring on a consistent basis. You might see this more in the case where somebody's doing like a research project and has a methodology to go out and track, measure the amount of forage in a field before it's grazed, and then you'd actually want to measure it again after it's grazed to be able to calculate how much forage the cattle actually consumed. But there's a lot of information out there for these different methods. Again, there's a method where you can use little meter square plots and cut forage and weigh it and convert that to dry matter. We can use a grazing stick to measure the height and density of forage and then calculate our forage quantity from that method. And then we've also got some the falling plate method where we've got a square of a known area that compresses the forage, and we can measure the height and use that to calculate our total amount. So anybody want to comment on your experience using any of these methods to calculate forage yields? One thing I'll mention that Janice brought up the other day is that One thing that these methods can be really helpful for is for beginning producers who are trying to hone their grazing eye. So to taking some samples throughout the season to help you understand what you're seeing visually and convert that to an actual number or quantity. These can be great, but like I said, I don't know too many folks who are out there taking samples every, every time the animals are like returning in their rotation.
So Ben shared in the chat that I use grazing stick, but I'm going to use the rising feed meter this summer.
Great. And are you, I'd be curious to know more about how you're using these. Are you trying to calculate, determine when to move animals? Are you trying to calculate a total yield throughout the season? So feel free to chat more. We can talk about it at the end too.
Yeah, we can. Or talk now.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben. Oops.
So for the grazing stick, we use that farm to let the farmer know how long to graze his cattle. He only had like 10 acres. He had 30. So with his production, like 4 hours a day. For my own experience, I'm seeing what's out there, and then I'm kind of on the art side of the grazing at home. I set it up and then make sure that my grazing heights are where they need to be to do it properly.
Awesome, thank you for sharing. So I just included this slide for anybody who is interested in trying out some of these methods to actually measure your forage production. These are resources that, depending on what's going on in your county, you may be able to find people with this expertise in your local CCE office, your soil and water conservation district, and your local USDA office. So I encourage you to reach out for support if you want to use those monitoring techniques. So the final method that we'll talk about today in terms of figuring out your pasture yields across the season is trying to calculate what your cows should be consuming based on what we know about cows and the size of your cows and the amount of dry matter that they should be consuming, plus what we know about what else you might be feeding them throughout the grazing season. So to just go right into an example, these are numbers from a farm that is fairly new to grazing. And so this is the first year that they set up a simple rotational system. There's probably lots of improvements that this farm can still make. So I'm not using them as an example of optimal grazing management, but just as some real numbers that we can look at to understand how we would go about calculating our pasture yields based on what we know about the cows and their diet. So in this case, we've got a herd of 45 Jersey cows, each weighing around 1,200 pounds on average. We're grazing 50 acres, and we had 138 grazing days in 2020. So we have two different diets. The farm feeds one diet from May 15 to July 31st, and then from July 31st until the end of the grazing season, they're supplementing with additional baleage. So in this first part of the season, we're getting 80 pounds a day of pasture into those cows. And we're saying that is 20% dry matter, resulting in 16 pounds per cow per day of dry matter consumed. And we're figuring that out because we're going to assume that the cows are getting 43.5 pounds of dry matter on average, again, based on their body weight and what their nutritionist calculates that they should be getting given their level of milk production. So we know the rest of what they're getting in the diet because we measure it and we feed it. And then we're subtract that from the total amount that they should be getting. And we're left with that 16 pounds of dry matter per cow per day during that first part of the grazing season. And then from August 1st to September 30th, we're feeding an additional 15 pounds of baleage outside on pasture while the cows are out grazing. And as a result, their pasture consumption is down to just 9 pounds of dry matter per cow per day for that part of the grazing season. So this final table summarizes what we just talked about. We've got early season pasture consumption at 16 pounds dry matter per cow per day. Late season, they're getting 9 pounds a day. And then we multiply the pounds per day times the number of days in each of those periods and times the number of cows. And when we convert that from pounds to tons, we've got 28 tons of dry matter consumed on pasture in the early season and 12 tons consumed in the later part of the season. So we know that for the season, our total pasture production was 40 tons dry matter. And if we divide that by the 50 acres that we were grazing, we had 0.8 tons per acre per year. And then to convert that yield to a dollar number, we need to know what this farm's cost of production was. So we're going to say they were a relatively low cost producer for their grazing system. Their pasture cost came out to $140 an acre. And then when we divide that by 0.8, we get $175 per ton was the dry matter cost of what they produced. So is that good? How do we feel about that number, right? We got the number. Now we actually have to think about it. Like, what does it mean? So the first thing we can do is we can take that number and we can compare it with the price of purchased feed, right? Because we would like to think that our grazing system is producing a cheaper feed than we could get if we feed stored feed, whether that's feed that we're putting up or feed that we're buying. So these are just some general ranges, price ranges for different types of stored feeds that we might want to compare to our grazing system. And again, you could pinpoint the actual number on your farm. And then we also need to think about the other costs we save by grazing versus feeding stored forages. So this would be the cost of time and fuel and machinery that goes into feeding cows in the barn, and also the cost of cleaning the barn and spreading manure, managing the manure. And then the final question, which I would always ask, but certainly in the case of this farm, this was their really their initial attempt at rotation grazing, and they were really satisfied with this result because they felt like it was a big improvement over the previous management. But we still probably have a long ways that we can go to improve their yields and to continue to lower their cost on a per ton of dry matter produced. So once we know the costs of our system and the benefits that we're getting, then we can ask this question of, okay, how can we do better? How can we improve? Before I get into that, answering that question of how we can do better, I just wanted to review quickly, kind of in theory and in practice, what we know about the value or the benefits of grazing. And these are particularly relevant to grazing dairies, but may also be relevant to other livestock systems. So we think of grazing dairies as having lower cost of feed in the grazing months, as having reduced fuel and machinery costs for feeding and manure spreading, again, during those grazing months. They may also have reduced costs associated with an overall cropping program because they need to have a much lower stored feed inventory to get through the year. So that may include investment, lower investment in cropland and machinery. We also expect to see an increase in labor efficiency with grazing systems typically, and additional herd health and welfare benefits. Now, all of these benefits assume that we are good managers of our system, of course. So if that's what we look for in theory, what do we know in practice about the performance of grazing dairies compared to non-grazing dairies? And there's not a lot of data out there, at least not a lot of recent data looking at this, because a lot of our grazing dairies are now organic, and it's a little bit harder to compare grazing organic dairies to non-grazing dairies selling into conventional milk markets. But we have a really good data set from 2006 to 2011 that looks at grazing dairies in New York State and compares them to non-grazing dairies of a similar herd size. So trying to control for differences in size, what do we see when we compare farms in those two groups? So we consistently see grazing dairies producing less milk per cow. However, they also maintain fewer tillable acres. They have more cows per worker, lower total investment per cow, lower cost of grain, lower total operating costs, and the grazing dairies reported higher milk prices compared to the non-grazing dairies. As a result of all of these things, grazing dairies outperformed the non-grazing dairies during the 6 years that the study was going on. And so one way to interpret that, it means that the benefits of the grazing dairy made up for the reduction in milk production per cow. However, over the same 6-year time period, the performance gap between grazing and non-grazing dairies got smaller. And there's not a real clear explanation for that, although part of it is that a number of farms left the sample or stopped participating in the dairy farm business summary during this time. And it's possible that some of the higher performing farms were the farms that stopped participating in the study. And then 2011 was the first year in this 6-year period that the non-grazing dairies actually outperformed the grazing dairies. And here's just a chart summarizing some of the key elements of this, this research. And it shows in the first line, the number of farms that participated in each year. So you can see the number of farms decreased over time. There were 42 grazing dairies in 2006 down to 28 in 2011. And these are all selling conventional milk. So there's no organic herds included in the study here. We can see that the number of cows was similar between the two groups throughout this period. We can see that milk sold per cow was lower in every single year for grazing versus non-grazing farms. We can see that our milk price per hundredweight was slightly higher for the grazing farms in all the years of the study. And I don't know exactly the explanation for that, whether they were selling to different co-ops, paying higher prices, or whether they had better components or something about the price structure that they were able to do better. We can also see that the grazing farms had lower total operating costs in each year. And then the bottom line shows net farm income, or the farm profit. And in every year except for 2011, the grazing farms had a higher net farm income per cow. So, so that is just kind of a summary of some older data. And then we also have research that backs up this claim that grazing dairies have some are able to achieve certain health and welfare benefits, particularly around lameness, which connects with what we learned last week from Betsy and Alicia. And also there's some evidence of lower cull rates on grazing dairies. So a couple caveats that I want to stress when we're talking about the benefits of grazing for dairy farmers. And one of them is that in order to achieve these benefits, the cost savings that you achieve or any price increases that you might be able to achieve by grazing have to make up for the lost milk production. If you're comparing two farms, all else equal, grazing dairies are going to make less milk. So we need to make up for that through these other, cost reductions primarily. And then the other thing I'll say is that grazing will not make up for poor management. So sometimes you hear these stories in the grazing literature about farms that are on the brink of failure and destruction, and all they need to do is switch to grazing and suddenly they're making tons of money and life is good. And I don't know about any experience, but I would say that, managing a grazing dairy takes a huge amount of management skill and ability. And so if our farm is struggling for poor management or lack of management, trying to switch to grazing or utilize grazing to, make up for poor management is not a good idea. Okay, so switching gears. We've talked about costs and benefits of grazing our cattle or grazing our livestock. So now, how do we think about improving our system? And I would like to present this framework that breaks down possible improvements into 3 different categories. And I'm going to argue that you should move in order through these categories and work through each one to make sure we're thinking about all the different types of improvements we can make. So the first type of improvement is where we increase the yield from our grazing system without increasing any costs. Essentially, this means better management, and we're going to talk about this more, but who wouldn't want to, grow more feed without actually having to spend any more money? That one is a no-brainer. The second type of improvement we can make is we can lower our costs without affecting our yields at all. And there's a few examples that I can think of in that category, and I will invite you all to help me, continue brainstorming as well. And then the final category, this is where most people start. So I think a lot of times people skip over the management options and the cost reduction options, and they go right into the third category, which is strategic investments that increase farm profits. And these are the ones that are exciting to think about because we get to spend money and buy cool stuff that we're excited about, like new technologies or fancy gizmos. And so the point here is that for this third category to actually result in real improvements, the investments need to increase our yields enough or more than enough to offset the cost of those investments. So these ones take a little more analysis to figure out, is this investment really going to benefit the farm? So, we're going to go through each of those 3 categories, but we're going to spend the most time looking at a couple case studies that get into examples of strategic investments. But to start, how many ways can you think of that you could increase the yield in your grazing system without increasing the cost? And again, it does not cost you anything to be a better manager. It's, maybe it costs some pride if you need to ask somebody for help. Maybe it costs some time that you're gonna sit around drinking coffee and thinking. But really, this is like the lowest hanging fruit. And we could, I could use this course. There are entire courses and books, the whole literature devoted to this topic of how do we improve our management, our grazing management. But just as kind of a quick summary, we've got a handful of different variables that we as managers control in the grazing system. We control the timing of when during the season do we actually let the cows out to graze. We control the duration of how long we keep animals on a certain area before we move them to another place. We control the frequency of how often animals are coming back to an area and regrazing a spot that's already been grazed. And then of course we control the intensity, which is the stocking density. How many pounds of grazing animal are we applying per acre, and what's the impact of that? And how do we adjust that based on the size of the area that we give to our animals? So all of these are variables or grazing factors that we manage, and we can make changes to how we manage these things without spending any money. So this is really the starting point for how do we begin to make the most out of our grazing system. So now it's time for another poll question. And again, this poll question gives a list of different management practices, and it's asking which of the following practices might you be able to use on your farm to improve grazing performance. So one might be waiting longer before you start grazing animals in the spring. Another option might be lengthening the grazing rotation when pasture growth slows. A third would be moving animals more frequently. A fourth option would be adjusting stocking rates throughout the grazing season. I'm sure there's many others that I can't think of. And there is an option at the end that your grazing management is already awesome, so none of these things would actually help you. And you can choose as many answers as you like in this poll question. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share the results. And yeah, this is great. So the 4 options that I gave, that somebody picked at least, or at least one person picked every one of those, and nobody thought that their grazing was perfect, which is probably true. And yeah, I mean, the whole point of this exercise is that it doesn't matter how long you've been doing this, you know, the grazing system is so dynamic that we're always going to be evaluating the opportunities for different management decisions that are going to improve our results. So on to the next type of improvement that we can make. And these would be improvements. Oh, sorry, before we get there. So we just talked about improving our yields at no cost to the farm. And there's a couple things that actually I'd like to sort of group with those improvements, because the cost to doing some of these things might be very, very small relative to the potential benefit. And basically, these are things that you can do that are going to help you to be better managers. So there's being a better manager, and then there's putting systems in place that are going to facilitate you to do better management. So the first one is making small investments in fencing and water infrastructure that's going to allow you to get the cows where they need to be when they need to be there. So an example might be getting some really nice reels and fence posts that makes it super easy for you to get out and chop up your bigger pastures into smaller paddocks and move those cows more frequently at certain times of the year. Some of these types of smaller investments or may involve some infrastructure investments, might even be eligible for cost sharing through an NRCS or soil and water program. So that would further reduce the cost of those types of things. And then another important one in this category, which Betsy talked about way back at the beginning of this series, is taking time throughout the season to actually evaluate the nutritional quality of the pasture and making changes to the ration that you're feeding in the barn in order to make the most of what they're getting from the pasture. So as the pasture quality, quantity, and composition changes throughout the season, are we adjusting our rations accordingly? And again, the cost here might be sending some forage samples out for testing, working with your nutritionist, but it's going to be pretty minimal. Okay, so now the second type of improvement that we can think about are things that are going to reduce our cost of production without reducing our yield. And just check in on the chat. So, but yeah, so these are things that most of the things that I came up with in this category have to do with making the most out of our overhead costs, or minimizing some of the overhead costs of our system. So I'm not telling you don't spend money on fertilizer here, but I'm telling you that how can we extend or get more out of those overhead costs? So the first example we talked about already, but can we extend the lifespan of our long-term investments so that instead of having to replace our fencing in 15 years or 20 years, we can keep it around and keep it operational for 25 or 30 years. That's going to effectively lower the depreciation costs associated with that investment. And all it takes is better maintenance and upkeep. The question of renting versus owning land is a big one in this category, right? So in many cases, the cost of renting land is going to be less than the cost of owning that same land. If you're a farm that already owns land, this might not apply to you, but if you're a newer farm or you're looking to grow your grazing operation, think carefully about this. Owning land is a huge overhead cost that limits your capital that you have available for other types of investments. We can think of labor oftentimes as a sort of an overhead cost to the grazing system, especially operator labor, which farms tend to be very hesitant to put a dollar value on. But we know there's a value to your labor because you could be doing something else when you're actually doing a sort of inefficient task on the farm. So anything we can do to increase our own labor efficiency as grazing managers is going to reduce our overall cost of the system. And then a final one that I thought of here was making hay when our pasture growth is outpacing our grazing consumption. And I think of this as sort of, if we take hay off of the grazing system without reducing the grazing yields, we can kind of give ourselves a credit, right? Part of the cost of our grazing system can get charged to our stored feed enterprise versus to the grazing enterprise. And so this would be in contrast to just clipping fields because the grass, gets ahead of us. We want to think about when and where it makes sense to cut hay. All right, so again, these are kind of these low-hanging fruit options, and you may already be doing these things, which is great. So then the next category, the final category of grazing system improvements are these strategic investments, where we're going to ask ourselves, do the benefits outweigh the costs? And I have a couple of case studies that we're really going to spend the rest of our time today looking at that really dive deep into the process of how we analyze these types of investments to help us make a decision about whether or not it's something that we would like to pursue on our farm. So I have two examples here. The first example, it really links back to the presentation that Don Burkhardt gave a couple weeks ago. So we're going to look at an example of grazing annual forages. And this reflects a change in operating expenses on the farm, right? An annual forage is grown for a single season. And so the investment that we're making in that, it needs to have a return or have a net positive within that one season to make sense for us. And so we're going to go through an example about how we would analyze the costs and benefits of that change. The second case study is based on a real example from a farm. And we actually believe we still have a producer from that farm on the call with us today. So he might be able to speak up and chip in. But we're going to look at a capital investment And that is paved laneways going from a barn out to the grazing paddocks on a dairy farm. And we're going to look at how do we analyze a long-term investment to see, again, if the benefits of that will outweigh the costs for our farm. So the tool that we use to analyze financial impacts of individual changes on our farm is called a partial budget. This is a tool that might be very scary to you if you're not an economist, but I'm here to tell you that it is not difficult. In fact, I think a lot of farmers do this in their heads, or they do it on a napkin or the back of an envelope. And if that is you, if that describes your practice, all I would say is you should probably be sure that you write this down, this activity. But the whole idea behind a partial budget is we're gonna think through specifically what is the change that we're making, what are the assumptions, like what do we assume is going to happen as a result of that change, and we make the assumption that we're isolating this one change, so everything else on the farm stays the same, which we know is never true, but that's kind of the assumption we make that allows us to isolate this one thing. And then we're going to use the best numbers that we can come up with and conservative numbers to try to reflect the reality of what we expect to happen on our farm. And, you know, it's important to note that the assumptions that we make for one farm might be very different than the assumptions we make for another farm, right? Every farm has different resources available, different constraints, different goals. So this is something that, you know, you could analyze the same change on two different farms and come up with very different results. And again, in order to go through this process, we need to make a lot of very detailed assumptions, which is why it's very important to write things down. Because if you don't write down all of your assumptions, and then you want to go back to this exercise and change one little thing and rerun your numbers, it's really hard to remember what you assumed. So you don't need to write a book about it, but take a piece of paper out, write down all your assumptions, and then you can refer back to it. All right, final poll question of the day. Have you ever used a partial budget to analyze a decision on your farm? So please take a moment and answer this poll question. Great. So this is fantastic. So we had no no's and nobody was not sure, which is really good. And we had all yeses and sort ofs. And I'm very familiar with the sort of because I've seen that strategy in action, and it's better than a no. But if we're at the sort of stage, you know, it would be great to get up into the yes stage with this exercise. And, you know, you can always get help from someone if if it's hard for you to get everything written down, get someone else on board to take notes when you're having this discussion and working through it. So now we're going to dive into our first case study. And this is completely hypothetical. So I don't have a real farm that I'm featuring here, but I'm trying to give you guys enough details to make this a realistic example. So for this example, we've got 100 cows grazing 90 acres, dairy farm. And this farm is going to plant 15 acres to annuals for grazing. So we're adding 15 acres to the grazing system. And these 15 acres, maybe they were in corn last year, maybe they were used for hay production last year. But this year we're going to put them into annuals and we're going to graze them. Our plan, and again, this is kind of based on what Don presented the other week, is we're going to plant a mix of triticale, rye, and forage pea in the fall. So the triticale is going to be our early spring and spring grazing annual. And then the rye will come on for summer grazing. There is a mix available at some seed companies. I think it's called like a triticale plus. So you can find this mix out there. And then on the same 15 acres in August, we're going to plant a mix of oats and peas, and that's going to be grazed into the fall season. So we're going to say that each of those crops is going to cost $140 to put in per acre. And those costs include purchasing seed, drilling, and fertilizing. So now we need to list all of our assumptions about what's going to happen, so that when we get to the end of this exercise and we see a number, we understand that number is based on these assumptions. And this is where we can have a lot of very healthy debate. You guys are welcome to unmute yourselves and tell me that I am crazy if I think I'm going to get 3 tons of dry matter of triticale, from grazing in this system. And the point is that the assumptions really need to match what you honestly expect is going to happen on your farm. And once we get a number, we can come back and we can change the assumptions and see, like, well, what happens? Maybe we would get this yield in a really good year, but what happens in a bad year? What happens if one of these 3 crops fails? Are we still going to break even or come out ahead with this investment, right? But for this example, to get through it, we're going to use a 3-ton triticale yield, a 3-ton yield for ryegrass, and a 2-ton yield for oats and peas. That's going to give us a net increase of 5 tons dry matter to the acre over what we would expect from perennial pasture or hay. And we're going to say that by grazing these annual crops, we're going to be able to extend our season 2 weeks earlier into the spring and 2 weeks later into the fall. So we get an additional 4 weeks of grazing, and we assume that when we're grazing, our milk production goes up by 3 pounds a day. So now that we've listed our change and we've listed our assumptions, we can go through the negative and positive impacts. So the negative impacts are pretty straightforward. We have the cost of planting these 2 crops. And then we also are going to count that those 15 acres could have been used to produce hay. And so we are losing the dry matter that we would have harvested if we'd use that for hay production. On the positive side, the biggest impact, the positive impact we're expecting, is a pretty significant increase in yield. And if we're valuing that yield, we've chosen here in this example to value that yield of the annual crops the same as we would have valued the yield of the hay crop. So effectively, we're assuming that the quality of these 2 crops is equivalent. And there may actually be some good arguments for achieving higher quality with these annuals, but of course that depends on the quality of our management. So we're showing a pretty big increased revenue in terms of the crop production itself. And then we have a smaller increase in revenue based on the increase in milk production. So we're saying we're getting 3 pounds per cow per day, additional milk for 28 days. And we're valuing that milk at $17 a pound, or $17 a hundredweight. So 17 cents a pound. And then we're also gonna have some decreased cost here, because for 4 weeks, we're not gonna be doing as much feeding and cleaning in the barn as we would otherwise be doing. So to summarize the results of our partial budget, we see a positive impact of this change valued at $23,868. We subtract the negative impacts, which were valued at $12,300. And we have a net impact of $11,568 from implementing this change on 15 acres. So now we have to like say, do we actually believe this? Like, are these numbers good? Should we trust these numbers? What happens if our assumptions are wrong? What happens if we screw up our planting? Or what happens if the seed doesn't germinate? And then it's also possible that we could actually do better than this, right? If everything works well according to the assumptions that we made, and what if we even achieve a higher level of feed quality than we would have with the hay? How is that going to affect the bottom line? So anybody want to comment on this example or share questions? Is this believable to you? What I'd really like to know is if anyone has done this and if they achieved these results. And we're going to talk about that a little bit at the end, but right now this is all theoretical, right? We've just gone through this example in theory. And so how do we know if it works in practice? Well, we try it and we keep track of everything, right? We need to monitor the change, how we implemented it, and what the result was in terms of, did we actually extend the grazing season by 4 weeks, or did we extend it by 6 weeks? Did we actually get the yield increase that we expected?
I like this example. You can mute yourself. Thank you. Thanks, much better. I really like this example because like it's such a big dollar value that it really gets your attention, right? And I think the good managers, like they look at this and go, boy, I think this is attainable because I can measure so many things. I can measure how many days we were in, what my milk response was when we get in there, all these other things. They're very tangible. So I really liked this example because of those very tangible results that we can actually measure.
Thanks, Betsy. And yeah, I actually do work with one organic grazing dairy that is doing some of this annual forage production, but they have not done much monitoring in terms of gauging the impact. So I can't actually use them as an example, but I need to get after them and see if we can figure out a way maybe next year to do some more monitoring so that they can truly document the value of that change for them. But in particular, the farm that I work with that's doing that is really limited on their land access for grazing. And so this is a way that they can hit the grazing target that they need to hit for the organic standard without having to get on more land. So I think they actually lost some rented ground, and then this is how they responded.
The other thing I wanted to add, when we look back to Don's presentation, like he talked about yields with using annuals that were rivaling corn silage yields, and nobody's going to graze corn silage, right? That's not how it works. And so it just is a really impactful way to get a lot of tonnage off of small acres to do exactly what you're talking about. So it's got my wheels spinning for sure, especially after you did this example. Absolutely, annuals are something that can be incorporated into my situation. So.
Cool. Well, thanks. All right, so let's look at the next one. This one is really cool. This next example. So this is a farm in Tompkins County that grazes 250 dairy cows on about 175 acres. And we've, I would say that this example is roughly based on the real investment that this farm has made, and then our projections of what the benefits have been. Although we are lacking some clear monitoring of certain items in this example. So we're going to take it for what it's worth. But here on this farm, we are grazing for 180 days. And for about 60 days, the cows are going out once a day. So they're just going out during the daytime. And then from about mid-May to mid-September, the cows are going out once during the day and then again during the nighttime. And every time they go out, they're getting a fresh area of pasture to graze. The change implemented by this farm was to make a pretty significant upfront investment in paving laneways going from the barn. So there was an existing covered barnyard, and that got extended as a concrete laneway about 150 feet. And then the farm also implemented 1,750 linear feet of asphalt lanes going out to most of their pastures. So what we're using, the numbers we're using here in this example is a $20,000 upfront investment in that concrete laneway. And we're assuming that that will have a 25-year productive life. And then we had a $53,000 investment in the asphalt laneways. So that was about $30 a linear foot. And we're giving that a 15-year lifespan, assuming that we're doing repairs and maintenance to that over time. So we're going to assume that we have to buy in a load of asphalt, on average 1 load per year, to patch potholes and fill cracks and things like that. So what are the assumptions that we are going to make in order to analyze the impacts of this investment? So for starters, one of the biggest things that the farm has observed and shared is a pretty significant reduction in lameness. So pre-grazing season, they were used to seeing 3 to 4 cows every month in the sick pen with severe lameness. After this improvement, that number went down to maybe 3 or 4 for the entire 6-month grazing season. And I guess just to back up, so I don't have any before pictures of the laneway, but what we were dealing with before, the paved surface was a laneway surface that was very muddy and rutted and had rocks and was difficult not only for cows, but also for people to traverse. It was pretty hard on the Kubota UTV to get around. And it was so bad that the cows didn't actually want to leave the barn to go out to pasture. It was like an effort to get a lot of them going. So we're gonna assume a reduction in severe lameness from 9% to 2% of the herd, reduction in moderate lameness by 10%. So that would be 25 cows over the season. We're gonna also assume a 2% reduction in the cull rate, again, due to the improvements to lameness. And then the next big benefit that was observed by the farm is that the cows spend less time getting from the barn to the fields. And part of that is that the cows actually want to go out and walk to the field. So they're not standing around in the covered barnyard all waiting for somebody else to go first. And then it actually takes them less time physically to traverse the path to the field. So that every trip, they're saving 15 minutes per trip. So when they're going out once a day, they're saving 30 minutes round trip. And when they're going out twice a day, they're saving 60 minutes per day. And we're kind of assuming that's like a time away from pen time. So the time away from the pen is being reduced because of this change. The farm also mentioned that they were able to change their hoof trimming schedule from every 3 weeks to every 4 weeks. And that the hoof trimmer is very impressed with the quality of the feet that they're seeing. So that was a benefit. And then just some reduced wear and tear on the equipment that they sometimes use to go out and move cows. And that it's just a much more pleasant experience for people now. If you're going to walk out and push cows, you're not as likely to risk tripping over and falling down in the mud. Okay, so we described our change. We listed our assumptions. Let's take a look at the impacts for this partial budget. So like I mentioned, in this case, we're looking at a long-term capital investment versus just a change to the operating costs. And so this is where we need to start thinking again about the depreciation and the opportunity cost of having that capital tied up in these investments to get a sense of the true economic cost of these laneways. So we're going to say that our depreciation plus the opportunity cost for the concrete lane was $1,300 a year. Depreciation and opportunity cost for the asphalt laneway was $4,858 per year. And we have an annual maintenance cost of $1,000. We also have $4,000 in decreased revenue because we're not selling 5 cull cows that we otherwise would have sold off the farm. On the positive side, we're assuming some increases in milk production because we've reduced the time away from pen. So we're going to say we had a 2 pound increase for 120 days, those days that they're saving 60 minutes. And we're valuing that increase at $17 a hundredweight. And we're going to say they had a 1 pound increase for the 60 days when they're saving 30 minutes away from pen. So those are pretty big. Together, that is over $12,000 of increased milk revenue per year because we've got 250 cows here. Then we also have a reduction in our cost related to this lameness improvement. So we're assuming, again, using numbers that Alicia and Betsy used in their presentation the other week, but we're assuming the cost of a severe lameness case is $300. And that includes both the cost of treating as well as the milk that we lose, the production that's lost. And then we had $90 cost for moderate lameness times 25 cows. And then we're also saving because we're not replacing the cull cows that didn't leave the herd. And so I've got the cost of replacements at $1,800 a head. And we're saving a little bit on equipment maintenance because we're not going off jumps in the Kubota UTV anymore. So what does that get us? If we summarize our partial budget, we're seeing positive impacts of almost $30,000 a year. So that's the improved milk production and reduction in lameness and 5 fewer replacement heifers. Our negative impacts are just over $11,000 a year. And that's mostly that annualized cost of the big long-term investment. So with these assumptions, we're showing a net impact that is positive and is greater than $18,000 a year. So how can we interpret these numbers? So one thing to think about, this improvement involved a really large, significant upfront cost. Not everybody can finance that out of pocket. So if we are borrowing money to make this improvement, we also need to incorporate the costs of financing or the interest costs that we would incur, as well as the cash flow for repaying that borrowed amount. So that would be a next step to follow up on. So we've seen, okay, this increases our profits, but can we manage the cash flow of borrowing and repaying financing if we need it? The other thing that we can look at here is if we take the total investment and divide it by the annual net impact, we can see that we have a sort of a 4-year payback period. So after 4 years, presumably the added profits that we've earned are going to offset that initial investment. So it's nice to see that that payback period is significantly shorter than the lifespan of the investment itself. If we're investing in something that's going to be around for 10 years, but our payback period is 30 years, that's not quite as appealing an investment. And then finally, I would say, this is a improvement that's already been made. And so we can go back to the farm and say, are you satisfied? Do you feel good about this? Like, whether or not you know what your numbers are, do you feel like this was a good investment for the farm? And I can say that in talking with the managers here at this operation, they certainly are thrilled with the results that they see in the health of their cattle. And I think they would do it again in a second. So I know we're out of time here. We just have a couple minutes left. So just the final point, and I mentioned this throughout, is if we don't monitor the impacts of the changes that we make, we're not really going to know if they were good decisions or not. It's almost like maybe we shouldn't monitor, because then we can believe that we make good decisions all the time. But in reality, we can't go, it's hard to adjust our course if we don't know how we're doing. So as we're making these decisions, we should be thinking about how are we going to monitor the impact. And for example, if you were going to invest in paved laneways on your farm, why not get Betsy or Alicia out there to do some lameness scoring before you make that change? And then 6 months after, 12 months after, bring them back out and do it again. And so we can actually quantify some of those improvements to know if our management is working. and bringing in outside advisors or even convening advisory teams can be a great tool to help keep farms accountable to their monitoring plans. Okay, so I know that was a whirlwind presentation. Hopefully it wasn't too intense for you guys, and I hope it gave you some good things to think about. And yeah, I would love to open it up for discussion and questions and feedback. If anybody wants to share, feel free to type away in the chat box or go ahead and unmute yourself, and we'd love to hear your comments.
So I'll just mute. Thank you. The second, while we're waiting for people to type in or raise your hand to be unmuted, that second example is really scary because it is a larger investment, and we make a lot of assumptions, and we list those assumptions, right? We wrote them down, the milk increases, the replacement savings that we're going to have. We wrote all of them down so we can track them. And I think that's key to really knowing if the decision we made, besides our gut, is the right decision, or we can reflect back upon it. If you don't write those assumptions down, I don't remember when you and I did the pasture cost calculator for my operation. I had to look back at the assumptions and go, why did we do things this way? And so with such a large investment, we have to write them down to know, I think, to make a best informed decision. Kind of rambling, but I think you know what I'm trying to get at.
And I guess I would just stress too that for any of these bigger like strategic investments, the examples we gave or I gave today, like grazing annual crops or investing in laneways, like these things assume that the system that you're currently managing, you're managing really well. Adding complexity, making big investments it's super risky if you don't have the management skills and time to do what you need to do to take full advantage, right? So the fact that this farm invested in laneways is great, but guess what? They're still like on a three to 4 week hoof trimming schedule. So they're not like giving up on basic preventative care and basic, herd management. They're just adding to what they're already doing. So that is something, no matter what investment you're making, you really need to be sure that you're doing all the basic management practices well before you're going to invest and add on to them.
So Tyler's got a question in the chat. Would asphalt millings be acceptable if they were rolled out with a roller? I think with any plan or anything you're trying to implement, go out and talk to people that have already done it and see which things that have worked for them and like the shortcomings for that. Because, we're talking about a change that maybe is a little novel. And so I want to talk to other people that have done it. Maybe it's perfectly fine. I have asphalt millings in my driveway and it looks a lot better than a lot of the laneways that I've seen dairy cows walk through. However, I'm not walking dairy cows through them, so I don't know. So I would just want to ask more questions before I go investing in something like that. Tim, you had briefly hopped on. I don't know if you wanted to say hello.
Hi, Betsy.
How are we doing?
Hey, doing great.
Good.
Doing great. Sorry having internet issues, but appreciate all the information. And will this be, I can find this elsewhere of the things I missed, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. I'm enjoying the series.
Great, Tim, thanks. And I don't know if you caught it, but I think there was a picture from your farm early on in the presentation. So
No, I missed it.
You'll have to go back and check it out.
I will do. Thanks.
The one other comment I'll make about the asphalt laneways that the farm shared with me is that they were engineered for cows, not for vehicles and equipment. And so it's up to you how well, or, basically how thick you need to pour your laneways based on the intended purpose. But it's going to be a lot more expensive if you're going to build them to drive equipment over versus just for the weight of your cattle.
Well, thank you, Mary Kate. If anybody has anything that they want to follow up on, feel free to reach out to Mary Kate directly. Or next week is our final session together, and hopefully Mary Kate will be able to come back and join us. We're going to have all of our speakers come back and do a panel. And Betsy and I have a few questions that we want to kind of throw out to get discussion started, but we also will be sure to open it up to all of our attendees if they have questions specifically that they want to hear more about from our speakers. Next week would be the opportunity for you to do that. So if you want to submit your questions for the panel ahead of time, you can either email us directly, or the survey, when that pops up, you can dump your question into that very last if you have anything else to share, and we'll go ahead and grab it from there. And one other thing about next week is that it does occur at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So if you are either not in the Eastern time zone or you have it scheduled in your calendar, something as 12:30 or 12, we are meeting at 7 p.m. So hopefully we will see you then. Mary Kate, thank you again, and hopefully we'll see all the rest of you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.